forgetting anything logistics-wise?
Nope, all good.
And I'm thrilled to turn this over to Susan. Thanks so much.
Oh, well, thank you for having me. The first question we threw out was, is anybody stressed? I mean, tongue in cheek. Or I could say, is anybody not stressed? And then the second question was, do you know any students struggling with remote learning? Because there could be many reasons students are struggling with remote learning, but we're going to pay attention today to the potential underlying impact of the stress that's going on. So take it away, Lilia. Click. She's going to click for me.
Oh, I'm
Can you
clicking.
click?
Marisa is.
Oh, Marisa.
So
Yeah.
sorry, I'm clicking, but nothing is happening.
There we go.
There we go.
So you double clicked. So anyway, my cute things aren't going to happen. So, you know, stress is more common than people realize. And so I don't need to read this whole list here of ways children can get stressed. And there's all kinds of studies, you know, about children being stressed outside of Katrina and war and pandemics. But just to remind us that this is very common pre-disaster and current disaster. So can you please click? So let's just talk about this pandemic. Can you keep click? Okay. And so what are some of the ways we could think about that, you know, that's stressful about what's going on for students now? And we think about, like, you know, generally we think about how children are can get disconnected from school. Now, not everybody is, but what's happening to so many kids, especially students with disability, is this disconnection from relationships with teachers. There's so much grief going on among our clients. Children have lost grandparents. There's a lot of illness, food insecurity, we know all that, but also this issue of frustration with online learning that we're hearing a lot about. It's not working for everybody. You know, the stress can come from, you know, a loss of predictability. Students are used to having their programs, a loss of structure, you know, the kind of connections with friends or relationships at school that they have, and all the other things that are going on. So I want to pay attention to that, because we're going to talk a little bit about what trauma is. Click. Can you click?
Mm-hmm.
You know, and you know, what it is and what it is not. You know, when we think about trauma, it's not an event by itself. It's a response to a stressful experience. And it's a response in which a person's ability to cope is dramatically undermined. So no two children are going to respond in the same way. Some children will be able to ride through it more easily than others. And what's so confusing about trauma is that you can have two children in the very same home, and something very difficult happens, and one child is able to manage, and another child might go on to even develop, you know, mental health diagnoses and other problems. So that's why it's so confusing. So we need to just keep aware that it's how children respond, and that's going to really help us at the public policy level to begin to know what to do. So click, Marisa. Thank you. Mm-hmm. So let's just talk a little bit about trauma and the brain. It's going to be a very simple overview, so we can begin to get to understanding what we need to do about this, or how we can advocate both at the policy level and on behalf of children. Individual children. So we know that brain functioning can be influenced by the environment, right? What goes on is going to influence the environment. Here's how, you know, one way to look at how it works. Click. And that what happens with traumatic experiences, it can arouse the brain's limbic system. And the limbic system is the area that controls the emotions. So think of that as the emotional brain. Okay? And when this part of the brain is aroused, you've probably heard about the fight, flight, or freeze response. You know, it can cause a child or an adult to kind of go into survival mode. It goes into a very primitive part of us that that it can cause a kind of fear that, you know, either helps a child stand their ground or run away or freeze. And that can play out in school in a lot of ways, and we're going to talk about that. Go ahead. The problem is if children or youth stay in the survival mode for a while or a long time, it's very hard to use their learning brain, right? So the emotional brain, it's kind of the largest, it gets very active, and then it's very hard to think straight. It's just logical, right? I mean, it's hard to focus, it's hard to pay attention, it's hard to learn. So it's really important to pay attention to this and to realize the positive side is if we can all work together to make sure students can, you know, stay out of that survival mode and into a calm brain state, then we can think about how we can really set the conditions for children to go on learning. So next slide. Okay. Now, how, you know, when children are in this state, how does it impact schoolwork? And we tend to think of it in three areas. We think about learning, actual learning. We think in terms of behavior, and we think of relationships. Now, it affects children in all different ways, but in the school environment and in the learning environment, the research tends to fall in these categories. And in terms of learning, it can really affect the foundations for learning. And it has a way, when it's in this survival mode, of having great difficulty processing language. You know, sequential organization gets a little out of sequence. You know, in order to read or to understand a story, it all follows a sequence. But when a child's dysregulated like this, it's really hard to follow sequence. And you can imagine how hard it is to read, or to, especially I think of the first graders who are just settling in to reading in spring. And then, you know, this is a really important critical time for them. But the emotionality that can get in the way can really start, you know, if, you know, getting in the way of sequencing the reading of sentences, sequencing the organization of understanding a story. And cause and effect can really be affected too, because there's nothing logical going on now. And you need to understand cause and effect to be able to follow a story, to learn. So let's keep going. So, and then the other part of learning we tend to look at is the process of learning, like the executive functions and transition and attention, you know, because, you know, executive functions are sort of the do, plan, review part, where you have to look at a page, you have to organize the page, and you organize a story, and you know, that can really be affected when children are in that survival mode, or if they're frightened for too long. And we want to get them out of that. We want to get them back to a calm brain, and we want to think about what we can advocate for them and what we can think about at the policy level. So in terms of behavior, you do tend to see all different kinds of behavior, because I was saying no two children are the same. Sometimes children feel a need for control, and you'll see more aggression or defiance. Or sometimes they want to cover up because they're not everybody's good at soaking things in on the web or doing this remote learning, and they'll act up just to get out of doing things. So you start to see the kind of behavior that can get in the way of learning. And then in terms of relationships, we'll be talking a lot about relationships as the key to helping children stay calm their brain in order to learn. But you can imagine how this state of being can interfere with relationships. That, you know, I'm sure there are many children, and I know many with disabilities, who really are sort of feeling a lack of trust in their school, or lack of trust in the teacher. Why are you not here? You know, You're supposed to be helping me hand over hand, and I don't like looking at you on the screen. And trust is critical to learning. I mean, learning comes in the context of a trusting relationship. So there are many ways here. I won't go into everything because I could talk forever about this, but the ways that relationships can be disrupted. And that could be happening with families too. And people want to be aware. Everyone needs to be kind to themselves because this is really hard. And sometimes we aren't, we don't think about that. We think, okay, we're just going to keep learning. And the students can keep learning. It's just, let's talk about, a little more about what might help them. So we want to go to the next slide. Okay, so what in trauma theory, when we talk about, okay, how do you help children overcome adversity? I mean, that's what we're all about, right? There's certain core values that are really important, especially when it comes to school. And the first one is safety. Children need to, I've already kind of alluded to this, need to feel safe in their relationships. And that's something that's really at risk here with all this incredible disconnection that's going on. And safety doesn't just, physical safety is critical, but, and we can't make short shrift of this because I've had so many clients who have family members who have died, elders who have died. I mean, you can imagine how unsafe a child might feel, how much grieving's going on. And that can really interfere with their learning. So we want to think, social safety, these disconnection from friends, they need to feel socially safe. They need to feel safe with adults. They need to feel safe to take a risk with their learning. And again, that requires a calm brain. Another piece that we focus on a lot in overcoming adversity at school and in learning is having a connection to the school, feeling part of the school, like I belong here. This notion of belongingness is so critical for everybody, to feel like you're part of something bigger than you and that you belong. And when you don't feel that way, it's an awful feeling, and it can interfere with learning in a big way. And so, of course, we talked about relationships and the importance of that. This issue of, self-regulation is very critical too, because when students, obviously dysregulation is going to get in the way, but we have to help children learn how to talk themselves down from this, how to be able to control their own emotions, right? I mean, it's not to say we have all the answer here, but these are the things we learned from the trauma experts and from our work about, if we help children in these areas, they can overcome all kinds of adversity, right? Now, this issue of academics, I know during the pandemic, I've heard a lot of different things about academics. I've heard, well, put that aside for now, or just focus on connection. But one thing to keep in mind about academics is that feeling competent is one of the greatest ways to overcome adversity. Now we'll talk about like the nuances of helping children feel academically and non-academically successful in the context of their learning, because just dumping MCAS on them or whole lot of things to do and not having them feel successful will add to their trauma. And we want to set conditions for children to find some sense of competency during this. And this is really important. And of course, we want to support children in their physical and mental health. Now, these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 attributes or areas to support in children are, it's important if children are traumatized. That's where it comes from. But what we've learned is it's important for all students because their brains are just, they're all the same, no matter who we are or what our race or creed. So you want to keep going? So, we're not going to go into a long piece about trauma, and it isn't going to be helpful, but we know there's certain core things we want to support. And the commissioner talks a lot about connection, connection, connection. And we think he's right on that. But what does that mean? And how do we build trusting relationships with educators? Because we know from understanding trauma how important that is, how important that the parents and family feel trusting of the school and they can connect, and the children feel trusting of their teachers and they can connect, and that the teachers understand what the child needs, that individual family and what they need. But when we think about parents talking to teachers, we want to, we don't want to just say, go tell them everything in the world, let's just think a little bit and maybe brainstorm together. What are some of the things that you might want the school to know? And I just want to say, it's really important to balance confidentiality needs. There's no reason to encourage parents to say more than they're comfortable saying, because this is all about building trust. So I worry on one hand, if we get, say, the department to make a list of questions to ask parents, that they might be too intrusive. And I worry also about putting too much burden on the parent to push for these kind of things. But at the same time, I thought it might be good to kind of look through this list. This is a brainstorm list. It came from some attorneys who work with families and some of the questions that have come up when their clients call, And I guess I would throw out for the chat, like, are these good questions? Are they written in a way that would be helpful? Because, what does the family want the school to know? And it really should be in the family's hands. We've had, all of these came from phone calls we've gotten or other attorneys have gotten. For example, who's the main point person? Because sometimes the parent works and can't pick up the phone at school, and then the school will send a spreadsheet of times they've tried to call and didn't get responses, but unaware that maybe somebody else, a grandparent, is the one who should be contacted. Can the child be the person? Does it make sense? The parent's going to know that and can communicate that with the school. There should be some kind of determination about who's the right person to make connection with the family. It should be somebody who already has a relationship with the parent or the child. The time of day, the questions about technology and language are critical, obviously. What do you need? And I think that's a lot of where the discussion's going. But also, what's the most comfortable language? We know that there might be a language in the home that's written on a form, but that might not be the best language to call in, that the students interested in speaking in, or the family. So I'm wondering if folks find these helpful. Are these things you would want to share with parents? Just the beginning ways of developing a trusting relationship without kind of putting anybody on the spot. Because I think this is where these reentry plans are going to be going. How are the schools going to connect? How are we going to help the child get in a place so that they're ready to return to school in a calm enough state so that they can learn? So I don't really have access. I guess, is anything going on in the chat?
Yeah, it looks like we have some teachers in the chat. So some folks are saying that somebody said, as a teacher, one of the first questions I try to ask parents is, how are you? And we also got, and how can I help you is also an important question to ask, if there's anything I can do for you.
Yeah, that's absolutely wonderful. And I'm sure you have wonderful relationships with the family. It's all about the relationship. And that's beautiful. We didn't put something on there because this was really, you know, the assumption was we were talking to parents. And of course, the parent could ask how the teacher is. You know, the teachers are really stressed. And I know there was talk at the education hearings about how many are getting burned out and a worry that we're going to lose a lot of teachers. So it can be really rejuvenating for the teacher too, to have a warm relationship with the family.
That's a good point. We do have a question from someone. We can take some time for that. The question is, our families don't have the tools they need to be successful. Many of our families only have one tablet to share between 5 children. How can we all help?
I think, can I pitch that to you, Julia? I mean, that's just a huge issue. This is a huge issue. And, but I think Julia's the one working on that, and I'd rather pitch that over to you.
Sure, happy to try to catch the ball. I think that's a big issue for many, many families that MAC and many parent and disability organizations are very concerned about. I think we found 2 things can be successful. There can be successful advocacy, and Lily is going to post our helpline that families or advocates can call our helpline if the lack of connectivity, the lack of a device, or lack of internet connection is an issue. We've had some success advocating at the local level or at the state level around that issue. There are sometimes ways to get those resources for individual families. And at the same, because it's a basic right? If a child can't access the remote instruction that's being offered, then there's, you know, the lack of connectivity ends up being overcoming an impossible obstacle to overcome without some assistance. At the same time, we are doing some state level advocacy and the Department of Ed is working really hard on getting the amount of funding needed to provide access to all families throughout the state, you know, whether the question is the lack of devices or the lack of connectivity or the areas in more rural areas where there isn't broadband available. There was some legislation that's going through the State House now that is trying to provide some of the funding through a particular piece of legislation. So we can provide more information to folks on our website about all that. But please call us if there are individual families who are having difficulty, because there are some advocacy tools that can help.
Yeah, and I've put that helpline information in the chat box. Sorry, did I cut something?
In terms of advocacy around building this relationship, there's advocacy at MAC and other places working together about what are the kinds of questions that the school should be asking. So I see all these wonderful questions. How are you? Is there anything I can do for you? Which is absolutely right. But, you know, it will be great to have people help think through what kinds of questions the educators should be asking. Do we want to build a portrait of the family so that when the child comes back to school, there's a real understanding. We're not starting from base 1 and there's a connection.
Okay. We have,
so
go ahead.
Go ahead. No, I can switch to the next slide but if people want to ask more questions.
Yeah, we have one other question that has come in, and while I'm asking that, I'm going to launch our next poll. This is an anonymous poll asking about disability. So there that goes. And our question is, what if you've communicated your concerns about the remote learning plan and the school still refuses to do any teleconferencing services with your child? What can you do?
I really hope people understand the advocates are still there and that there are just times when you need to call our helpline or other helplines and if you're not having success on your own. Like for an example, like there's an attorney had a client who's, you know, parents, you know, just wasn't getting connected to. There was no information coming. And so she finally called an attorney who called the school, and the school said, oh, we're trying, you know, and the attorney was able to solve it easily because he said, well, this parent, it works all day and can't get emails, but she can get texts. And they kind of resolved it that way. And on this language thing, as Julia was saying, there's a lot of advocacy going toward that, and we're not there yet. But I think the more pressure we put on, people shouldn't be afraid to bring others to the table on that. So go.
We just have one more comment from somebody. The families we support who have younger children are saying they're regressing, but the biggest issue for our families right now is the teenagers and young adults' mental health, which is most concerning. Not connecting to their peers and having their parents with them 24/7 is causing more trauma because they're not on the same page.
This is one of the biggest problems. The students with mental health issues, the students with substance abuse issues, who are used to being in relationships with other peers who support them, who help them, and children with mental health issues. It's a great concern. And, you know, I can't give any easy answers because I know it's terribly hard. But we can talk about in the next slide some of the core issues that can be at the heart of exacerbating the stress. And we can talk about, in a nuanced way, about how parents can begin to share some of the things that are core to trauma about their student in a way that doesn't feel invasive or intrusive. You know, I think there's been a big problem with, at least from my experience, of parents even wanting to share with the schools when they have a child in that kind of a situation because they're afraid they're going to get a truancy officer in the door or a 51A filed. I mean, and this is not good, and this is where the advocacy must go. But if we look at the, you know, remember we talked before about there's certain core issues. If students are supported in, they can overcome a lot of stress. So I wanted to talk about, let me see, I got to get that out of the way. I wanted to talk about these 4 core areas and suggest that people might want to gather information in each of these and then begin to develop kind of almost a rubric of data that you have on your child so that you can begin to have a good way to share what your child needs. And whether you're sharing it with the community-based mental health provider or whoever the mental health provider might be, or with the school. And some of this won't be comfortable to share with the school. But if we know, for example, number 1, that positive relationships with adults and peers are critical. Students becoming more and more isolated, not connecting to peers, not connecting to adults. It's really important to observe this, gather information in it, and then really think, hopefully with an advocate or someone you trust, how can I share this with my provider or my school? What does that mean? Are there people there who are interested? I mean, if they're not, and they're just going to be punitive, then of course the parent's going to pull away, but maybe there's a provider who could really help with that. The other issue is the self-regulation, because remember, if the limbic system just stays out of control, it's very hard to get it back in. And it's going to exacerbate any mental health issues for sure, but it's also going to exacerbate learning problems. So observing when the child gets out of control, when, and learning who out there can be helpful in a positive way. And again, calling the helpline to get ideas for those who can help, and also ways to talk to the school about it and actually be heard. I think it's a very nuanced conversation. And the issue about, you know, I've talked to so many parents who say, well, I'm not going to tell them my kid's not doing anything, because they're just going to really come down on me. But if you can kind of observe, you know, what they're successful at and what they're not successful at, and find something, if you can find an educator who cares about your child and really think about, okay, they can't get everything done that you're asking on the screen every day, but what chunk can we pull out that could help my child be successful and feel successful? Because that feeling of success is what's going to help reduce that that overwhelming feeling of getting out of control, right? And then, you know, physical and mental health, you know, you know, we talk a lot to the, you know, the CBHI providers, and they seem to be working really well. It's just so hard, and I don't think anybody has any answers about how to do mental health services well over the phone, or how to, you know, deregulate a child who's saying, you know, I'm leaving, and, you know, that's that. And, you know, it's so important and so difficult for parents. And so I'm very reluctant to say, oh, go tell your school this, go tell your school that. But what I am saying is there anybody in the school who you can have a connection with, and your child can have a connection with, because that will go miles until we can get back to some kind of normalcy and structure and predictability, all those things we've lost because of disruption. I would suggest focusing on these 4 core areas, because that's what the research tells us will help the children stay in that calm state and out of the survival mode and able to manage. Does anybody have questions?
Thank you. We do have more questions coming in, but some of these might be answered in the rest of the presentation. So I did want to say that we'll be on until 9 o'clock to take your questions as well, if people are able to stay later.
Oh, was it supposed to end it? Okay. Because let's see, when I click, let me see what we have. Oh, okay. Oh, okay, so I thought that it might be helpful, because none of us have any answers. So I'm sorry if you thought I could just give you some magic bullets, but what I thought we could possibly do is have a discussion about things you've heard about that have worked that we could share with each other, or ideas. And we have, sounds like we have some great teachers too, and parents. The one thing I've put up at the front, I called alternate advisory, because we had a team meeting with a student, and you know, again, this parent worked with an advocate, but she had a student who didn't want to go to they have advisory at his school, but he was not going to do that, and was staying up till all night playing games with his friends. So she couldn't get him to sleep, and she couldn't get him to connect with advisory. So after having some discussion with someone she trusted or felt comfortable, they came up with the idea of, well, let's do an advisory meeting with those 3 kids. And they weren't in the same class, but what difference did it make? Let's just have an advisory with these 3 kids, and the kids loved it. And he started going to sleep because they were getting what they needed. So there's a lot of things that families can pick up on. And I hope sort of looking through the trauma lens might be helpful. You know, we talked to a lot of trauma sensitive educators, and, you know, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot from the educators here, but like the one about, I thought it was nice making the schedule with the parent that not only included how you're going to do your schoolwork that day and your Zoom and all that, but get up, brush your teeth, you know. I mean, it's not like any panacea, because we're hearing nothing but about older kids sleeping all day. I mean, it's not like, but we are hearing some successes. And so, you know, a lot of families have loved it when they're invited to be part of the morning meetings. Or I know a school in New Bedford has a lot of bilingual paralegal. So they, even if the child could speak English, they would have the bilingual paralegal to translate for the parents. And that created the relationship that we're looking for. And, you know, one high school we knew set up meetings 3 times during the day. So you could call in at any time to ask your question, not any time, but any time among these 3 times, you know, and that made it a little easier. And they got that because the parents were telling them they're overwhelmed. You have a calling time at 8 in the morning and I'm getting off to work or whatever. And, you know, it's really about people listening to each other and breaking the barriers. Because now parents and educators have to partner, and family engagement is going to be a much bigger issue going forward. And certainly our advocacy will focus on that, what that means, and how do we do it in a way that actually works. So I just thought, you know, we could do people in the chats have other things that worked, other stories that might be helpful.
Yeah, if you have anything, please share that in the chat. We do have a lot of questions that have come in, so
Just ask questions, because
okay. Do you find a difference between synchronous and asynchronous learning affecting students differently?
well, maybe others can answer that better than me. I mean, I'm getting many, because I work in trauma and mental health. I'm just getting a lot of calls about it not working. And so I wondered if others, maybe from PAL, could answer that or better.
Okay.
Because
There are some comments here where one parent is saying that asynchronous teaching can be more convenient for some students, and that the synchronous teaching causes their child a lot of stress and anxiety, and the child's asking them to turn off the camera because other peers are doing it. And then another parent is talking about how important the real-time interactions are for kids who are working on social skills, but that it can't work without the support of probably the kind of connected person you're talking about, Susan. So those are some of the things that are in the chat that are related to that.
I guess I do want to point out, the issues we're seeing a lot with children with sensory issues on these Zoom calls. Just terrible anger and breakdowns and just hating it, And, I was talking to one parent about, creating that relationship at school to help them understand it. And she said, I'll try, but I'm afraid to tell the school how extreme these temper tantrums are. I'm afraid they're going to call DSS on me, this is what people are dealing with. And yet connectivity is going to be what's going to help that child, an individual conversation. I said, just get the teacher to call him, tell him she cares about him. He can't wait to see him, that he so belongs here and how much she misses him. We've had kids just bask in that when they can make it happen. And sometimes the advocate or the family has to facilitate that. But particularly with kids with sensory issues. But I don't know what others are seeing.
I'm seeing some comments here about, and I imagine this is a lot of people's experience and frustration. And again, the districts, I think the teachers, the administrators, I think I counted wrong, we're in week 10, have been working really hard to figure out how to do all this, which, as Susan said, it's never been done before. And so, unfortunately, the kids are suffering as there's so much trial and error, right? Trying to figure out how to make these connections and how to help kids feel safe. And so one person just said that some teachers just won't call. And so again, it's this balance of reaching out to the teachers. The commissioner has issued this beautiful guidance about how for kids who are having difficulty engaging, they should find somebody connected with the child, just the way Susan's talking about, to reach out and connect with them. And it's just really important to, and it's hard to do, to find the right balance of how to reach out, how to advocate enough, because these things are not happening quickly enough the way they really need to be for kids.
No, the work has to be like, to me, a lot of the advocacy work is to be in really, I don't want to say training teachers, but helping them understand how, you know, they need to feel safe. They don't often feel safe themselves, and they need to feel calm and regulated in order to hold a child. And they need work, lots of presenting, to learn how to reach out and talk. And I know in the Boston Public Schools, they're doing, you know, the union's doing a lot of training and work to help teachers know how to ask the right questions. You see me being so utsy and trying to be careful in the kind of things parents might want to share, because they might not have an ear on the other end that's empathetic. And they may, you know, can be a teacher who's feeling burned out with 3 kids herself, who are out of control. And that's why I want to encourage people to be careful about who you share with. But if you can find that connection, the simplest thing, like an advisory with the kids' buddies, instead of, a class, you know, he's an integrated child. He's in the special ed sense, but his teacher helps him in the integrated class, and he wanted to, it's not that easy on Zoom, you know? So, it's hard, you can't read the child, and it's so easy for them to go off in their minds when they're under stress.
Yeah.
But love matters, and parents are so important, and they've got to be appreciated now, and we've got to elevate the importance of what this partnership is and sort of have new kinds of relationships. We're not there yet, but
There's some great discussion happening right now in the chat box. If people haven't checked that out, I would encourage you to do so. There, you might have answered this already, Susan, but somebody did ask directly, can schools refuse synchronous teaching?
can schools refuse to do it?
Mm-hmm.
Or are you saying, can the student refuse to go? Which one is it?
They asked, can schools refuse synchronous teaching?
And instead do asynchronous? Could you explain more what you're saying? I mean, refuse to do anything? Is that the question?
I don't know what they meant. If whoever asked that, if you
Refuse synchronous teaching, that's when you have a class Zoom, right? Julia might have more of an answer than me, but I mean,
I think it's
the other ways.
You know what the federal and state guidance have repeatedly said is that schools are required to be implementing the services that are in the IEP, obviously in a way that they can, that's safe with the schools closed. So I think that there's a very, you know, with this delicate way that Susan's talking about, there's a way to reach out to school districts and also advocate for school districts. If your child isn't able to access remote learning, or if they need synchronous real-time interaction and teaching in order to implement their services and meet some of their most basic needs, and that's clearly something that the law would contemplate even during the pandemic, that should be worked out with the school district. I do think a lot of these things can be worked out with, you know, obviously working out with your teacher, the principal, going up to the special ed director if needed. If things can't be worked out, the same kinds of advocacy mechanisms are available in terms of filing complaints, but we are finding that a lot of things can be worked out, but they can't, it's so much is on the backs and the shoulders of parents right now. But the more they can hear from you what is going on with your child or what the barriers are, the more they can creatively problem solve how to meet your child's needs when they're really reacting to this very scary and discombobulating situation.
I guess I'd say again, you know, encourage you to call the helplines, because it's like what Julia is saying, you know, at least the legal services lawyers are telling us, it often just takes a phone call to solve something that's incredibly frustrating to a parent. Like, help find a very simple solution, because nobody's expecting everything to be perfect, but these core issues of safety and relationships and connectivity and self-regulation, these are at the core of it. And if we can articulate ways to help children feel that kind of safety, at least it's a foundation for learning going forward. But I think it's okay to bring in advocates on this. Don't stay in spinning. It's concerned us because when we do get a call, a third party with a cool voice can often, find a solution, Well, she likes to be text instead of emailed, because her cell phone doesn't take emails, these a lot of simple ones, and then a lot of really hard ones when it gets to mental health, autism. I mean, we know it's really hard. I mean, even when kids have been going into mental health placements at high rates, and then they're alone, because their parents haven't been able to go visit them. It's not like it's more lonely, and yet parents sometimes have to call mobile crisis.
Yeah.
But the school should still be connecting, even if they're in that placement. And I hate putting the burden on the parent to create this kind of nuance, but I think that's where we are right now. And we must begin to really help the teachers understand how to do this connecting. Some are great and some are, or it's an opportunity to help more people understand this.
We have a question from a parent here. I've had several issues with my frustrated daughter connecting to the school's platform. They use Google Classroom. She's gotten so frustrated that she will no longer engage with the school. She doesn't like to engage normally anyway and was struggling at school before the pandemic. I've been trying relentlessly to correct and reconnect her to school. I don't know what to do next. Any advice?
Well, that's where I would call one of the helplines, because at least try, and maybe Julia has a different view, but try to get another voice in there. The frustration, I mean, I don't mean to put Marisa on the spot, but she's talked a lot about her experience with students being very frustrated with online learning, even when they have adults in the home who can help them. I don't think it's the panacea. I think it could be a good adjunct going forward, but how could we ever create the connections that make learning possible?
Marissa, did you want to add anything?
I would just add, I think finding someone at the school, whether it's that teacher, school counselor, school administrator, whoever it might be, who could really take that frustration seriously and begin to problem solve. Because I think, once you reach that point, the best place to focus is to just try to help the student cope with that level of frustration and just to bring it back down, and try to get some collaboration going with the school in whatever way that's possible.
Yeah, I think if somebody called our helpline with that question, again, we'd ask a lot more details than we have time to do now, but I think one of the first things we would do, and hopefully there would be one person, we'd talk to the parent about if there's one person in the school who they think the child would be most likely to connect to, and then talk with the parent about how to work with that person to begin to develop some solutions, because you want somebody also knows your child who before COVID and can help them understand and develop some strategies. It might be step by step by step, but to give you the child some hope and some connection. So that's the kind of thing. I mean, but it's the creativity, and then it may require some advocacy to get those things to happen as well. But so many people in the school, what we hear from educators, is they're so worried and concerned about kids. Everybody's trying to figure out many people are trying to figure out how to make the connection that's going to reach kids who are not engaged. So I think, just really reiterating what everybody else has been saying already.
Yeah. But usually there's one person. And then we've heard positive things when, to have, when a teacher partners with the school counselor together, because, it was one teacher was telling me about, she was doing morning meeting with her kindergartners, and then one of them started crying because her mother was in Haiti and she missed her, and then somebody else started crying because her grandmother died of COVID, and the whole thing burst into tears. They burst into tears, and she put them in little channels and tried to calm this one down and that one down. I mean, it's really challenging, and not enough resources, but this team teaching seems to have helped with a lot, because it's all about human contact. That's how learning happens. And so, and I did like the commissioner's memo on connectivity, but I think there needs to be a lot more flesh on what that means and how we're going to set conditions for that to happen.
Okay, we have time for a few more questions. I'm going to launch another poll. This is our final survey, just to get your feedback on today's chat.
And before we go to the next questions, just to say that it's expected that the state is going to come out with some additional guidance around the special ed procedures and processes. So many parents, so many educators have a lot of questions about things. And so for our chat next week, I saw there are a lot of questions here about advocacy and strategies and kind of what the law and policy are. So next week's chat will be exclusively around an update about what the new updates are in policy and practice from the state, and then giving folks time to ask all these types of questions that we're seeing in the chat now. We won't have time to get to tonight. But if we haven't gotten to your question about your individual child, please feel free to email or call our helpline. And then Lilia, it's almost 9, so we have time probably for just 1 or 2 more questions.
Yeah, and we'll also be sending an email out to all registrants tomorrow with information on next week's chat and resources and the recording from today's chat as well, and our helpline information and all of that. So we'll do a couple more questions before we go. I thought this was a good one. Can a parent assert the right to accommodations for their own disability and their role as parent vis-a-vis the school?
What a wonderful question.
Absolutely.
I
Don't you
would
think?
say yes, yeah.
I mean, in the same way that if a parent goes to an IEP meeting and they might need a sign language interpreter, or they might need an interpreter. It's not a disability accommodation, but they need language access. If I believe that the federal law would make it clear that we don't know what kind of accommodation you're talking about, but generally it makes sense to me legally. You think so too, Susan?
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, everybody needs to be kind to themselves. I mean, parents have suddenly been asked to play this enormous role. Teachers have buildings and structures and desks and places to send kids, and here's some parent all by themselves. And I think it's really important, to think about yourself and the kind of stress you're under, and to recognize that, and to think about ways to help self-regulate and keep up your relationships, and because that's how you'll best be able to help the child and advocate until we get through this.
Great answer. All right. That's it for questions. I'll put some resources into the chat box. And again, you guys will all be getting an email tomorrow with resources and information for next week's chat as well. If you have any suggestions for future chat topics, we are doing these every Thursday at 8 p.m. Please let us know what you'd like to hear more about in the chat box. Also, we'll keep that open for a little bit.
And before we end, I just wanted to thank Susan Cole. We really appreciate your sharing your wisdom, your experience on such an important topic in such a difficult time for families, for teachers, for educators. and for students everywhere. We know we'll be getting more guidance and tips from you over time. We can share those with folks. Somebody asked if the recording can be shared with others. Yes, it'll be on our website. And we hope you have a good week. Hope that you can notice that it is a weekend and enjoy a 3-day weekend. And we look forward to seeing you all next week. But thanks again to Susan and her team for putting this together.
Thank you very much. I just want to say the book that you saw in the slides will be posted, but the book at the end, Helping Traumatized Children Learn, if you're interested to understand many more of the nuances of trauma's impact on learning, it goes into much greater detail. So it's a free downloadable, and it tell that just click that link and you'll get there to it.
Right.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Good night to everybody.
Good night, everyone. I just dropped all those resources in the chat box. Keep those topic suggestions coming in. We are looking through those.
So.